If Odysseus ever breathed, if he ever felt the sting of brine in his nostrils and the weight of wet wool on his shoulders, then something intimate has been stolen from the world. What is stranger, that people can recite his cunning across 3,000 years, or that the hands that first held his tale are gone without names? Tonight, in this soft hour when the mind loosens its grip, let the missing parts be the lullaby. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like it, share your location and your local time so this midnight story can find you where you are. There is a quiet contradiction at the heart of the Odyssey, and it is not the one most people notice. It's not merely that gods walk into kitchens, or that a man survives what should have ended him 10 times over. The deeper contradiction is simpler, almost administrative, almost boring, which makes it more unsettling. The poem is full of precise social gestures, gifts counted and folded, oaths made with practiced wording, feasts performed with a strict choreography, ships described with workman detail. Yet the world that produced those details sits behind a veil, half lit, half erased. The Odyssey is treated as a map, but the paper it was drawn on is missing, and the ink too. One can feel the absence most sharply in the question that refuses to behave. Who exactly wrote this down? When did an ocean of spoken lines harden into a single river of text? The old debate circles it like a patient predator. A single poet named Homer, a blind singer with a memory like a temple. Or a tradition, a chorus of bards whose phrases were passed hand to mouth, generation to generation, until someone finally pinned them to parchment. The so-called Homeric question is often introduced like a classroom problem, but in the dark it changes its shape. It becomes a question about loss. What disappears when a living voice becomes writing? And what disappears when writing itself is delayed for centuries? Because between the supposed age of Odysseus and the era when the poems were likely fixed in written form, there yawns a stretch of time that feels like a torn page. The late Bronze Age Aegean had palaces, bureaucracy, tablets impressed with script, and the cold efficiency of accounting. Then, around the 12th century BCE, that world fractured. Sites burned, trade routes thinned, populations shifted. A long dimming followed. A period later, Greeks themselves remembered as earlier and rougher, less adorned with certainty. If a hero once returned to Ithaca, he would have returned into a century that was itself trying to return from ruin. Some call it collapse, some call it transition, some call it a set of local disasters mistaken for a single apocalypse. The phrase "sea peoples" floats through the scholarship like a mask, alluring and frustrating, a label for raiders and migrants recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, a hint of movement without a clear face. Earthquakes have been proposed, droughts, internal revolt, systems that grew too tight and then snapped. One can sense how tempting it is to pick a single cause, to name the beast. Yet the evidence keeps slipping. A palace archive burns, and the fire preserves some tablets by baking them hard, while the rest of the library turns to smoke. How much of history survives only because it burned in the right way? That is the first fog layer in Odysseus's saga. The possibility that his world ended, then reassembled itself with different rules, leaving only song as a bridge. And song is a strange bridge. It can carry detail, yes, but it also transforms detail into something more useful than truth. It becomes a tool for continuity, a way to claim that the present is the rightful heir of a shattered past. In that sense, the Odyssey can be read as a kind of bandage laid over a wound that never fully closed. The story does not only describe a man trying to get home, it may also be the story of a culture trying to persuade itself that it still has a home. And then there is the smaller, sharper disappearance, the scripts themselves. The Messenian world wrote in Linear B, a syllabic script used for administrative records, not epics, but it existed, and it proves that writing was not alien to that era. After the collapse, Linear B vanishes. Centuries later, a new alphabet arrives, adapted from Phoenician forms, and suddenly the Greek language has a different set of bones to hang itself on. What happened in between? Was the ability to write lost widely, or was it hoarded narrowly? Did some families keep the trick alive in private like an illicit fire, while the public world went illiterate? If so, what else could have been kept, and what else could have been selectively forgotten? The Odyssey itself seems to know this anxiety. It is obsessed with recognition and concealment, a scar under skin, a name withheld, a stranger tested, a story told in disguise. Even Odysseus, when he finally steps onto Ithacan soil, does not announce himself like a simple hero. He lies, he performs, he becomes a nobody. One might wonder, in a more speculative mood, whether the poem is whispering a method, survive by being unreadable, return by becoming unrecorded. The hero's greatest talent is not strength, but controlled uncertainty. And what is controlled uncertainty if not a kind of power over memory? There are places where this becomes almost uncomfortable. The poem spends long, patient time on the destruction of a household from within. Suitors eating a king's provisions, drinking his wine, pressing his wife, mocking the old order. It is domestic, not cosmic. Yet behind it trembles the larger historical possibility. After the palaces fell, did power repeatedly reorganize itself through predation that looked ordinary at the table? In archaeology, collapse is layers of ash and broken pottery. In lived, experience collapse is often a room full of men laughing too loudly while someone else's stores run out. And still, the poem is not simply a lament. It preserves something else, a memory of networks, of routes and coasts, of islands that feel placed with intention. Scholars have tried to map Odysseus's wanderings onto the Mediterranean, sometimes as earnest geography, sometimes as symbolic terrain. The effort always leaves a residue of doubt. If the wanderings correspond to real sailing knowledge, how was that knowledge preserved during the centuries of disruption? If they do not correspond, why does the sea feel so practical, so textured, so salted with realism? Is the poem a fossil of actual voyaging, or a dream built from the vocabulary of sailors? Even the most famous moments contain this double feeling. The lotus eaters, that soft oblivion, so sweet it makes men forget home. Is it only a fantasy of exotic plants? Or does it echo real intoxicants, real encounters with cultures whose rituals threatened identity? The Cyclops, brutal and solitary, outside the law of hospitality. Is he a monster, or a distant reflection of societies the Greeks could not assimilate into their moral map? The sirens singing knowledge that kills. Does that not sound like the danger of certain truths? The kind you cannot unhear, the kind that make ordinary life impossible afterward. The poem never confirms, and that is part of its seduction. It teaches the listener to live inside ambiguity the way the sea teaches a sailor to live inside weather. But if one keeps returning to the historical rupture, the questions start to sharpen. Suppose the Odyssey is not only a story carried across time, but a story shaped by time's damage. Suppose parts were lost, and the remaining fragments were stitched together with new ideology. Suppose certain memories were too politically dangerous to keep intact, and so they were transformed into gods and monsters safely unreal. If a civilizational reboot occurred, whether by drought, quake, invasion, or internal fracture, who benefited from the version of the past that survived? In the darkness, one might imagine a room where an old singer recites the tale to a young one, and the young one edits without meaning to, smoothing what does not fit the present. Or imagine an early scribe newly armed with the alphabet, choosing which variants to preserve and which to discard, because no page is infinite and no patron is endlessly patient. Or imagine a city-state eager to claim noble ancestry, encouraging a particular heroic tone, a particular moral geometry. These are not accusations, they are the soft mechanics of transmission. Memory is always pressured by hunger, fear, pride, and the need to belong. So the saga begins not with a ship, but with a gap, a silence shaped like centuries, a vanished script, a burned archive, a culture trying to remember itself without the tools it once had. Odysseus, in this light, is less a man than a method, a way of surviving discontinuity through cunning, through story, through becoming whatever the moment demands. And if that is true, then the first mystery is not where he sailed, or whether he lived, but what the poem is quietly compensating for. What wound in history required a hero of such relentless adaptability? What was broken so thoroughly that a civilization needed to invent or preserve a master of return? And if the past was curated once, gently, invisibly, like hands rearranging objects in a dark room, what makes anyone so certain it cannot be curated again? Part 2. If the past was ever selected once by invisible hands rearranging memory the way objects are rearranged in a dark room, what granted them the right to choose? Or is the question colder than that? Could it be that nature chose for them, with a sweeping erasure so thorough that people were left holding only what could be carried in breath and rhythm, the kind of knowledge that can be sung when hungry, when cold, when lost? And if that is so, then Odysseus, that master of return, begins to look less like a man and more like a late-born remedy, a figure invented to soothe a world that once could not return at all. There is a peculiar feeling when the mind lingers around the years near the 12th century BCE. Not the clean sensation of a single storm that passes, but the oppressive sense of a long season of doors closing, storehouses thinning, harbours falling quiet as if the ropes themselves had forgotten their work. Places that had been bright with bronze and ceremony, palaces that once counted oil and wool with obsessive precision, are abruptly interrupted. Some burn, some are abandoned, some remain, but with fewer hands, fewer shipments, fewer reasons to believe that the old order will be restored if one simply waits. In that dim interval, a story about a man trying to reach home begins to resemble a collective obsession, a recurring dream shared by the whole Aegean, as if the sea itself kept repeating the same nightmare. People speak of the late Bronze Age collapse as though it were a stone dropped into water, but the water refuses to grant a single ring. The ripples fragment into smaller ripples, overlapping, dissolving, refusing the comfort of a simple geometry. There are clay tablets at Pylos, hardened by the very fire that destroyed the archive that held them, as if disaster accidentally became the last librarian. There are desperate letters from Ugarit, messages that sound like someone shouting from a shoreline while enemy ships gather offshore, and then, abruptly, no more voice, only the archaeological silence that follows when the shouting was not answered. There is Hattusa, heart of the Hittite world, left behind like a room from which the air has been withdrawn. If this were a story, it would be one where torches are lifted to see the way forward, only to reveal that the road itself has vanished. And then there is the name that hangs like a mask, the Sea Peoples. 2 words that lure the imagination forward and then punish it for wanting clarity. They appear in Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions, in stylized figures with unfamiliar headgear, in lists of names that feel like stones dropped from a mouth that no longer remembers the full sentence. Yet Who ever said a single label could contain the reality of starving families, armed migrants, raiders, refugees, soldiers without a state, communities pushed from their land by drought or by other powers moving in the dark behind them? If the sea filled with boats, was it an invasion? Or was it flight in formation? The kind of flight that wears armour because it has learned that mercy is not reliable. Every hypothesis here is a small lamp in fog. Some point to earthquakes, a kind of seismic storm along fault lines around the Aegean, walls collapsing without an enemy ever touching them. Others point to drought, to traces in lake sediments, in pollen records, in tree rings, the subtle wrinkles on nature's face that later minds learn to read. Some speak of a climatic shift around 3,200 years ago, cooler and drier, not an instant apocalypse, but the slow withdrawal of the one substance that makes civilizations feel permanent: rain. If harvests fail again and again, what holds a soldier's loyalty to a palace? What keeps a craftsperson's faith in a king? When bread becomes scarce, oaths begin to weigh less, not because people become evil, but because hunger makes morality feel like an expensive ornament. And still, there are those who distrust the seduction of a single cause. Those palatial systems were intricate machines. They depended on stable trade for copper, tin, timber, textiles, luxury goods, and the constant movement that made elites feel immortal. They depended on administrators, scribes, storekeepers, tax collectors, guards, and messengers. When one link breaks, the whole chain trembles. If a ship fails to arrive, a storehouse fails to fill. If a storehouse fails, wages fail, loyalty fails, security fails. Collapse does not always come as a dramatic roar. Sometimes it arrives as a persistent murmur, like insects eating the beam of a roof, until the day the roof finally falls and no one has the strength left to look up. In the middle of that cracking, something stranger appears. Memory does not vanish completely. It changes shape. In the centuries that follow, the Greeks no longer live in the Mycenaean palace world, and Linear B disappears from ordinary life. Yet the poems preserve shadows of older patterns, the ritual of hospitality, the choreography of gift exchange, the anxiety over honour, the careful attention to feasting and carving meat, the obsession with names and lineage and reputation. Is that an authentic residue of life before the rupture, carried intact through oral tradition like an ember protected in ash? Or is it a reconstruction, a stage built by later generations, a past rehearsed into existence, because the present needs a noble ancestry to feel legitimate? Here, Odysseus begins to resemble testimony more than character. Not testimony that gods literally walk among mortals, but testimony to a survival skill. The ability to move through wreckage without being swallowed by it. Imagine a time when sea routes were no longer safe, when a harbour could become ash overnight, when an island could shift from sanctuary to trap, when strangers might arrive not with trade but with hunger sharpened into violence. In such a world, cunning stops being a literary charm. It becomes a defence mechanism. The mind becomes more valuable than the blade. A timely lie can save a crew. A hidden name can preserve a life. Ambiguity itself becomes shelter. And perhaps that is why the story of returning home might have been nourished by people who had no home to return to. Survivors of repeated shocks need to believe that wandering is not only fleeing. They need to believe there is an Ithaca somewhere that remains fixed while everything else moves. Yet in reality, many Ithacas must have changed hands, changed populations, changed languages, changed gods. If a world restarts after fracture, it needs a thread connecting it to what was lost. That thread is not always stone inscriptions or archives. Sometimes it is a song, because song is portable, and because song can make a ruin feel like a prelude instead of an ending. But song also knows how to hide. It wraps difficult memories in imagery that is easier to carry. It compresses political upheaval into the safe shapes of overthrown kings and parasites in the house. It turns hunger into contrary winds. It turns migration into being blown off course. It turns foreigners arriving by sea into monsters, so the listener does not have to look directly at the more frightening possibility that the monster may simply be a human being driven mad by need, pushed to the edge, desperate in the same way anyone would be if the world narrowed to a single question of survival. And a grain of sand keeps rubbing the mind raw. If palaces fell, if writing vanished from daily life, if trade networks collapsed, then who kept the story alive long enough for it to be fixed into a poem centuries later? Shepherds on hillsides, old sailors by a hearth, communities that repeated the tale to remind themselves they were still themselves. Or a narrower group, still powerful, still remembering, who understood that controlling the story is a way of controlling the future. And if such a group existed, what did they remove when they chose to preserve Odysseus? Because Odysseus is an unsettling choice. He is not clean. He lies with ease. He survives by uncertainty. He wins by misdirection. Why would a culture rebuilding after catastrophe elevate a man like that as its emblem? Is it because the poem is quietly teaching the next generations something they cannot be told directly, that in unstable times even ethics must bend like willow branches if the roots are to remain? Or because the story was shaped by those who endured the rupture, those who knew that naked truth sometimes cannot be sung without frightening the living into paralysis? And there is one more question, light as mist but clinging like salt. If the Bronze Age rupture was a tear in memory, is the Odyssey showing the frayed edge of that tear? Or is it stitching it closed with thread dyed prettier than reality? If one follows the seam carefully, will the fingers be those of nature, of war, of drought and hunger, or the fingers of someone who chose to mend the wound in a particular way, so that part of the injury's true shape would not be seen? If the saga is a stitch pulled tight over a tear, then the next question is almost too simple to trust. Where exactly was the wound first made visible? Everyone points toward Troy as if pointing solves anything. Yet Troy is less a place than a layered argument, a hill that keeps swallowing its own past, rebuilding over ash again and again, until even certainty feels like an intrusive modern habit. If a war happened there, did it happen once, or many times, and did later mouths fold those separate fires into a single shining blaze because the mind prefers one clean catastrophe to a century of smaller griefs? The soil at Hisarlik does not speak in names. It speaks in strata, in walls that thicken and thin, in gates shifted slightly as generations reimagine where danger comes from. When Schliemann cut into the mound with his impatient trench, he wanted Homer to be a map and the earth to obey it. He found treasure, he found drama, he found reasons to argue, and he also found the first modern lesson of Troy. Even the search for truth can become another kind of conquest. Later archaeologists slowed down, listening to the careful grammar of pottery and building phases, and the story grew more complicated. Which layer is Priam's city? Which destruction belongs to the right century? Which burnt beams deserve to be called the remains of a world-defining siege rather than the ordinary violence of a strategic site on a narrow waterway? The accepted candidates shift with the decades. One layer looks wealthy, with strong fortifications and seems to end in destruction. Another looks poorer, more crowded, more like a city under stress, perhaps receiving refugees, perhaps swelling the way threatened places swell. And then there is the awkward fact that the poem's Troy is not only walls and fire. It is also speeches, genealogies, divine debates, formal duels, and long emotional scenes that feel shaped for performance rather than documentation. Archaeology can show that a city burned. It cannot show that Achilles sulked, or that Helen leaned on a parapet and named the Greek captains with a voice full of slow regret. If those scenes are inventions, what were they invented to cover? If they are memories, why were they remembered with such theatrical clarity when so much else fell into silence? Even the word Troy trembles in the hand. The Hittite texts speak of Wilusa, a place that many scholars cautiously align with Ilios. They speak of Ahiawa, a power across the sea that tempts comparison with the Achaeans. Treaties mention kings and borders, disputes flicker, and still the documents are partial, as if one is reading the corner of a letter with the main sentence torn away. The names are close enough to tease, far enough to deny. It is the perfect condition for obsession. Is Wilusa the Troy that later Greek singers mourned, or is it simply one of several nodes in a political web, later elevated into myth because it was convenient to have a single dramatic origin for a whole heroic age? One could linger on a darker possibility. When societies break, they do not only lose things, they also gain opportunities to reorganize memory. A glorious war can become a foundational story that justifies new hierarchies if the palatial world fractured, if elites scattered, if newcomers arrived, if old lineages thinned or were replaced. Then an epic of ancestral heroes could function like a passport. It could certify legitimacy. It could whisper, "This is who we have always been," even if the actual record is a patchwork of migrations, marriages, and forced forgetting. What better proof than a song that everyone agrees to repeat? And yet the song itself, if one listens with patience, does not sound entirely like propaganda. It is haunted. It keeps describing bodies stripped, cities smoking, women carried away, children orphaned into the future. It knows that victory is not clean. The Iliad ends not with a triumphant banner but with a funeral. The Odyssey, which grows out of that aftermath, feels like the long-delayed cost of the war, the debt still being collected years later in storms, in shipwrecks, in madness, in the slow corrosion of home. If a narrative was curated, why leave so much bitterness in it? Unless bitterness was part of the function, a warning disguised as entertainment, a way of teaching that glory always drips with something darker. So Troy becomes both a sight and a mirror. A sight, because walls and arrows and burned grain are real enough in any age. A mirror because later listeners can project onto it whatever they most need. A lost golden age, a moral lesson, an origin of suffering that excuses present anxieties. The more the historical record breaks apart, the more the myth becomes smooth, polished by repetition, and that polishing itself can feel suspicious. What gets sanded down when a story is told for centuries? What sharp details were too dangerous to keep? Odysseus, in this light, begins to look less like a random survivor and more like the hinge between two worlds. He leaves one order, the order of warlords and treaties and fortress cities, and he returns into something else, something uncertain, where a man can come home and still not be recognized, where even his own house can become foreign. That is not only a domestic drama, it is a psychological echo of civilizational rupture. After collapse, the landscape can be familiar and still unrecognizable. The stones are the same. The people are not. Or perhaps the people are the same, but their loyalties have shifted like sandbars. And so the question tightens, almost tenderly, around a single invisible object, the missing version of the story. The Odyssey we have is a selection, a final weave. But oral tradition implies variance, competing performances, lines altered for local pride, for political need, for the taste of a particular audience. Somewhere, There must have been other Odysseuses, other Troys, other endings, carried for a while and then dropped. Did they vanish because they were less beautiful, less memorable, or because they said too plainly what should only be said through monsters and gods? If a scribe finally fixed the poem into writing, whose interests did that freezing serve, and whose memories did it quietly bury? The mound at Troy keeps its secrets by being too generous. It offers too many layers, too many plausible answers, too many ways to be almost right. And the mind, tired and comfort-seeking in the late hour, might accept an almost right answer just to stop the ache of not knowing. But the ache may be the point. If history has been rebooted, if the archive has been burned and rebuilt, then certainty is the luxury of those who did not have to survive the fire. So the fog thickens around Troy, not because nothing happened there, but because too much could have happened, and later generations may have needed one story to stand in for a whole era of fractures. And if Troy is a symbol made from rubble, then what other symbols are made the same way? What other ruins have been arranged into a narrative that feels inevitable, simply because someone, somewhere, could not bear the shapelessness of loss? A city can burn and still leave a footprint, but a home is harder. A home is supposed to be small, intimate, stubbornly particular. It is a threshold worn by familiar feet, a roof that knows the sound of a single family breathing beneath it. And yet Ithaca, the most longed-for point on the map of the Odyssey, keeps behaving like a moving target, as if home is not a coordinate but a spell that changes each time someone tries to pronounce it with certainty. If Troy offers too many layers, Ithaca offers too many candidates, and the contradiction from the last movement returns, sharper now. How can the story be so precise about longing, and so elusive about the place that longing claims to recognize? In the Ionian Sea, islands sit like dark thoughts on water. Their slopes are green in spring, harsh in summer, and the coves can look like open hands or clenched fists depending on the light. Modern Ithaca is small, close enough to be circled by a patient boat in a day, yet complex enough in its folds of mountain and bay to hide centuries in its creases. The Odyssey describes a homeland that is rugged, goat-friendly, good for harbours but not for horses, a place the hero calls low-lying, though the real Ithaca rises steeply. People argue about that line the way people argue about a single word in a will. Is it a poet's convenience, a mistranslation, a clue that the name Ithaca once belonged to a different island or a larger region, and later drifted, as names sometimes do, like wreckage that keeps floating long after the ship is gone? This is where the search for Ithaca becomes less like geography and more like a study of how humans handle absence. Because there are ruins, yes, but ruins do not come with labels. A Mycenaean wall does not announce whether it belonged to a king who inspired a poem. A potsherd does not confess the name of the hand that lifted it from a shelf 3,000 years ago. Archaeology can offer presence, but the poem demands identity, and identity is the most fragile artifact of all. There are places on Ithaca that have drawn hopeful attention for generations. One is the cave at Polis Bay, often called the Cave of the Nymphs, where finds have suggested a long ritual use, including offerings and later inscriptions that speak of Odysseus as if he were already a figure receiving reverence. That alone feels like a whisper from a different angle. Not proof, not the kind of evidence that slams a door on doubt, but something more intimate. The trace of people in historical times treating Odysseus not merely as a character in a tale, but as a presence anchored to a specific landscape. Yet even that raises questions that do not sit still. If later Greeks honoured Odysseus in cult-like ways, were they remembering something old, Or were they building memory out of poetry, turning story into shrine because humans cannot bear for beloved figures to remain only words? Then there is the stubborn problem of a palace. The Odyssey's Ithaca is a place with a hall, with storerooms, with servants, with a threshold, with a courtyard where men can be tested and punished. The poem is lavish with domestic architecture, not in the manner of a blueprint, but in the manner of someone who knows how a house feels from the inside. The suitor's crime is not abstract. It is physical. They consume the household day by day, as if they are eating the idea of continuity itself. So where is the house that could have inspired such obsessive attention? Excavations on Ithaca have revealed Mycenaean remains in more than one area, including traces of settlement and tombs that suggest the island was not empty in the late Bronze Age. That matters, quietly but stubbornly, because for a long time the popular imagination treated Ithaca as a poetic invention, too small to deserve such an epic role. Yet even when the island's Mycenaean footprint is acknowledged, the next step remains slippery. A settlement is not automatically a palace. A palace is not automatically Odysseus's, and Odysseus himself may not have been a single person at all, but a composite shaped by centuries of singers, a name used as a vessel for many returns. And so the longing shifts sideways, into hypothesis, into arguments that feel almost like myths of their own. One of the most haunting is the idea that Homeric Ithaca might not be modern Ithaca at all, but a different part of the Ionian world, perhaps even a portion of Kephallonia, such as the Paliki Peninsula. The suggestion often leans on a geological imagination, that earthquakes, landslides, and marine sediment could have altered coastlines since the Bronze Age, turning a once separate island into a peninsula, rearranging straits and bays, changing what across and beyond meant for a sailor, navigating by landmarks and stars. The Ionian region is seismically alive after all, and anyone who has watched an earthquake redraw certainty in a single minute knows how plausible it can feel, emotionally, that the map itself is not stable enough to be trusted. But plausibility is not the same as demonstration. Geology can show that landscapes change. It can show fault lines, uplift, subsidence, the slow violence of time. Yet to claim that an entire Homeric homeland has slid into a new shape is to ask for a chain of evidence strong enough to hold a heavy desire. And desire is the danger here. People want Ithaca to be findable because the mind wants the story to be anchored. The mind wants to stand somewhere, point at stones and say, "Here, this is where he slept. This is where she waited. This is where the world was repaired." But what if the poem's deepest truth is that repair is not a location? Even the poem seems to warn against easy recognition. Odysseus returns and no one knows him. He walks on his own soil and must pretend it is foreign. He tests the people he loves, and they test him back, as if homecoming is not a reunion but an interrogation. In that sense, Ithaca is not only a place to be found, it is a condition to be proven. And that makes the archaeological hunt feel strangely mirrored by the narrative itself. The modern world digs into earth, searching for the hero's house, while the hero in the poem digs into human behaviour, searching for the shape of loyalty. There is another layer, quieter, more unnerving. The possibility that the palace described in the Odyssey is already an anachronism, a memory of Mycenaean grandeur filtered through later centuries that no longer lived that way. If the poem was fixed in the early archaic period, when Greece was forming city-states and new social orders, then the domestic world of Odysseus might be a retrofitted stage set, built from fragments of older palatial culture mixed with the realities of later elite households. Not a lie, exactly. Something more human and more difficult. A sincere reconstruction. The way people describe a lost childhood home from memory, making the rooms larger, the table heavier, the light more golden, because the heart insists that what was lost must have been substantial enough to justify the pain. And if that is true, then the missing palace is not merely missing from the ground. It is missing from time. It belongs to a blended era that never existed cleanly in one place. The Ithaca of the Odyssey becomes a collage. Some Mycenaean stone, some archaic custom, some singer's knowledge of how smoke behaves in a hall, some political need to portray a rightful king whose household order must be restored by violence. The result feels real because each piece is real, but the total may be a mask that fits no single skull. Still, the islands refuse to stop tempting the imagination. Every cove can look like a landing. Every terrace can look like the footprint of a wall. Every spring can seem like the one where a tired traveller washed salt from his hands. And the danger is not that such imagining is foolish. The danger is that it is too easy, and that ease can be manipulated. If a community, ancient or modern, can claim, "This is Ithaca," then it can also claim, "This is the rightful lineage, this is the proper story, this is the version you should repeat." A place can become an argument. A ruin can become a certificate. And once a certificate exists, it can be used to exclude other memories, other possibilities, other songs that might have told of different kings, different homes, different endings. So the fog thickens again, but now it smells like rosemary and sea salt, like stone warmed all day and cooling slowly at night. Ithaca might be here, or it might be elsewhere, or it might be a name that travelled while the land stayed still. The poem might preserve a genuine geographic memory, or it might preserve something even stranger, the shape of longing itself, so precise that it feels like a map. And if the earth will not give up the hero's threshold, perhaps that refusal is part of the saga's original wound. After collapse, after migrations, after the slow rethreading of culture, maybe home was no longer a single place anyone could point to with confidence. Maybe it had become a contested claim, a story people needed to win. And that leaves a question that does not want to be answered quickly, not if the listener is willing to stay in the dark a little longer. If Ithaca cannot be pinned down, if the palace cannot be named with certainty, if the landscape itself might have shifted, then what exactly are people chasing when they chase Odysseus's home? Are they hunting a man, or hunting permission to believe that return is possible? And if someone, sometime, learned how to control that permission by controlling the map, what else might they have learned to move quietly while everyone else kept pointing at the wrong shore? If Ithaca refuses to sit still on the map, then perhaps the map was never the point. Or perhaps the map was the first thing to be tampered with, because nothing is easier to control than a route that only exists in someone else's telling. The last movement left a taste of salt and uncertainty, the sense that home might be portable, political, even engineered. But if that is true, then the sea becomes more than scenery. The sea becomes the archive, and archives are famous for what they swallow. A ship can vanish without leaving even a rumour of its bones. A coastline can change its shape and pretend it never knew you. So what do we really have when we claim to follow Odysseus across water, from island to island, episode to episode? A journey or a pattern imposed on loss? The Odyssey is strangely practical about sailing, at least in the moments when it decides to be. It knows the feel of wind behaving badly, the way a night can stretch when land is only a suspicion. It knows that boats are not ideas, they are labour, wood, rope, cork, the sore hands of men who do not get to be heroic when the sea is indifferent. And yet, the same poem gives the sea a supernatural appetite. It offers whirlpools that seem too neat to be real, rocks that crush ships on schedule, a god's grudge that behaves like weather with a memory. that tension is not a flaw, it is a clue. Because ancient people did not separate natural hazard from divine agency the way modern minds like to pretend they do. A storm that kills your friends is not impersonal. It has a face, even if you invent it after the fact. The question becomes quieter and more troubling. What real maritime knowledge might be hiding inside the myth, and what real maritime fear might be disguised as a monster so that the mind can tolerate remembering it? In the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Mediterranean, ships were the bloodstream of power. Copper from Cyprus, tin from far away, pottery, grain, textiles, luxury goods that made elites feel chosen. When those roots weakened, palaces did not merely lose supplies, they lost predictability. And if the earlier movements circled the idea of collapse, then the sea is where collapse becomes personal. A disrupted land still offers a road. A disrupted sea offers only the suggestion of one, and suggestions can betray. There is a tender precision in the famous line where Odysseus is told to keep the bear on his left as he sails, watching the stars while the rest of the world is black. It sounds simple, almost soothing, like a bedtime instruction, but it opens a darker corridor if one stays with it. Star navigation is not a mythic trick. It is a learned intimacy with the sky, and it implies repeated voyages, repeated returns, a tradition of observation that outlives individual ships. If the centuries between the Mycenaean world and the poem's written form were truly a dimming, then who kept this sky knowledge alive with enough confidence for a poet to treat it as familiar? Is it the memory of sailors, passed along with calluses and curses? Or is it a later sophistication painted backward onto an earlier age, a kind of retroactive competence that makes the heroic past feel more capable than the ruins would suggest? And then there is the matter of distance. The Odyssey's sea is not empty. It is crowded with others, with strangers who might offer hospitality or might offer a knife. This matches something archaeologists and historians have long noted about seafaring worlds. Ports are mixtures, and mixtures are unstable. The sea connects, but it also spreads trouble. In periods of stress, those connections can flip from trade to raiding without changing the shape of the ship. A merchant vessel and a pirate vessel can be the same hull with a different hunger. If the late Bronze Age collapse involved migrations and raids, then the Odyssey's constant anxiety about landing among unknown people begins to feel less like fantasy, and more like a memory that has been moralized. The poem does not simply say, "the sea is dangerous." It says, "the wrong shore will test whether you deserve to remain yourself." It is tempting to place every episode on a modern chart, to match the Lotus Eaters here, the Cyclops there, Circe somewhere else, until the wanderings become a puzzle that can be solved like a game. Yet there is something childish in that hunger for exactness, and the poem itself seems to resist it. The episodes do not behave like itinerary entries. They behave like thresholds. Each island is a different kind of forgetting, a different kind of temptation to stop being a person with obligations. The lotus is not only a plant, it is the idea that the past can be made painless by being erased. Circe is not only a sorceress, she is the fear that life among strangers will change you so thoroughly that you will not recognize your own face when you try to return. The Cyclops is not only brute force, he is the nightmare of lawlessness, the place where hospitality is mocked and the guest becomes meat. If these are symbolic, they are symbolic in the way trauma is symbolic. The mind cannot store the full event, so it stores a shape that can be carried. Still, symbolic does not mean unreal. Whirlpools exist. Sudden squalls exist. The Mediterranean has straits where currents behave like moods, and coastlines where an approach at night can turn a careful sailor into driftwood. Even the famous clashing rocks can be heard differently if one imagines narrow passages, reefs, or the terrifying optical tricks of navigating near cliffs in low light, where the sea and stone can seem to move, and the sirens, those voices that promise knowledge so sweet it kills, could be read as a mythic gloss over a very old observation. Certain sounds can draw attention away from survival. Waves against rock can hypnotize. Wind through caves can mimic singing. A sailor who leans into fascination instead of discipline is a sailor the sea will correct. There is also the question of memory embedded in the technology itself. Shipbuilding in the Bronze Age was not simply craft, it was social continuity. It required forests, tools, trained hands, and the confidence that building a ship made sense because there would be trade, or war, or both. When systems collapse, skills do not vanish evenly. Some survive in pockets, some are hoarded. Some are reinvented with cruder means. The Odyssey's ships are sometimes described as if the world still has the infrastructure of large-scale voyaging, and sometimes described as if everything is improvised, as if survival itself is stitched together from what is still available. That inconsistency might be poetic freedom, or it might be a seam, showing two eras overlapped, two memories fused, a palatial sea and a post-palatial sea, merged into one haunted water. And then there is the strangest thought of all, the one that fits the saga's obsession with curated memory. What if the route is not meant to be followed, but meant to be believed? A wandering hero who visits edges of the world makes a culture feel larger than it is. A hero who survives impossible hazards makes a culture feel chosen. And a hero who returns, purges his house, and restores order offers something even more useful than wonder: permission. Permission to use violence in the name of return. Permission to call certain intruders parasites. Permission to treat a disrupted household or a disrupted society as something that can be cleansed back into purity. When a story turns chaos into a sequence of trials, it makes chaos feel governable, and that is a kind of control. Yet control is never perfect. The poem's sea keeps leaking dread. It keeps admitting how fragile men are when the horizon closes around them. Odysseus survives, yes, but everyone around him seems to pay the cost. Companions die, ships vanish, time is eaten. Even when he is held in comfort, even when a goddess offers him something like immortality, the poem makes it feel less like a reward and more like a soft prison. Which raises a question that does not rest. If the Odyssey is a curated survival manual for a culture after rupture, why does it sound so tired? Why does it keep returning to the idea that the sea takes more than it gives, and that every gain has a shadow that cannot be paid off? Perhaps because the sea is honest in a way politics is not. Land can be fenced, stories can be edited, but water keeps moving, and it keeps evidence poorly. It does not preserve the way clay does when it burns. It does not keep inscriptions. It keeps only what sinks and what washes up, and even those can be rearranged until they mean whatever the finder needs them to mean. A wreck becomes treasure. A drowned crew becomes a cautionary tale. A wrong turn becomes a god's anger. And somewhere in that shifting, the simplest human terror remains unchanged. The fear of being unmoored, of losing the thread that tells you who you are. So the journey continues across the black surface, guided by stars that do not care what names people give them. And the fog thickens again, not over an island this time, but over the question of whether Odysseus's route is a record of navigation or a map of psychological survival drawn onto the sea because the sea is the perfect symbol for a world after collapse. If the archive was burned, if the homeland moved, if the story was stitched and restitched, then perhaps the only stable thing left was the night sky. But even that stability invites a final unease. If stars can guide a man home, can they also guide a culture into repeating the same pattern of longing, wandering and cleansing over and over, until the sea forgets the difference between return and exile? If the sea is the archive, then the shore is the margin where the archive leaks, where what was swallowed is occasionally returned in strange forms. The last movement ended with an unease, that a route can be more than a rote, that a story can teach a culture how to justify its own violence. But the poem does not keep Odysseus on water forever. It keeps steering him toward landforms that feel older than cities, older than treaties, older even than the kind of gods who argue in bright voices on Olympus. It steers him into caves, groves, springs and thresholds, places where the air changes, where sound behaves differently, where people have always sensed that something watches from behind the visible world. And if memory was curated, if certain histories were made safer by turning them into monsters, then these places might be where the poem hides the most delicate residues, the erased religions, the outlawed rites, the older names that had to be repainted. Caves are never neutral in human imagination, and they are not neutral in archaeology either. They preserve, they shelter, they trap. In the Mediterranean, caves have been used for burials, for refuge in times of raiding, for long rituals that do not want daylight. They hold soot and bones and offerings, the sort of evidence that survives precisely because it is tucked away from the ordinary churn of rebuilding. When the Odyssey speaks of the cave of the nymphs, it is easy to treat it as scenery, a poetic flourish. Yet the image of a sacred cave with its mixing bowls and stone looms feels uncomfortably specific, like a memory of real cult practice refracted through myth. People in later Greek periods did leave offerings in caves associated with nymphs, and nymphs themselves have the texture of something older than a neatly governed pantheon. Local spirits of water and shade, intimately tied to landscape, difficult to standardize, difficult to fully control, and control matters because religious change is one of the quietest ways a world reboots. When palaces fall, when scribes vanish, when alphabets arrive with new elites, belief does not simply continue unchanged. It is reorganized. Gods are renamed or promoted. Old female figures become dangerous. Local spirits are domesticated into nymphs or demoted into monsters. One can almost hear the administrative impulse behind the mythic surface. Let the wild sacred become a story. Let the story be repeatable. Let it travel without requiring the original place or the original priesthood. Consider Circe, not merely as a sorceress, but as a problem that refuses to behave. She lives on an island at the edge of the known, surrounded by wolves and lions that are, disturbingly, not quite wild. They act like remnants of men. She knows herbs. She knows transformation. She feeds strangers and changes them. In a later moral framework, she becomes a cautionary figure. The seductive danger of the foreign woman, the threat of losing one's human form. But beneath that, there is another possibility that scholarship has circled for a long time in comparative mythology, that Circe preserves a trace of older Mediterranean goddess traditions, the kind connected to animals, to liminal knowledge, to the power of women over life and death, powers that later patriarchal orders found necessary to contain. It is not that Circe must be really a goddess from some specific cult, pinned down like an insect. The point is subtler. The poem places Odysseus in contact with a feminine power that is not Olympian in the clean public sense. It is domestic and terrifying at once. It works through food, through hospitality turned predatory, through the intimate act of ingestion that makes boundaries blur. This is the kind of power that new regimes often fear, because it is hard to legislate. It belongs to kitchens and forests and whispered knowledge about plants. So it becomes myth. It becomes an episode. It becomes something the hero can survive, dominate, and leave behind, carrying the lesson without needing to respect the source. And then there is the undercurrent of ritual. Odysseus does not simply wander. He performs. He sacrifices. He listens to instructions that sound like ritual prescriptions. He digs a pit. He pours libations of honey and milk, wine and water, sprinkles barley, offers the blood that draws the dead like a scent. The Nekia, the calling up of shades, is one of those moments that feels less like entertainment and more like a preserved shiver from real religious practice, or at least from real religious imagination that had rules. Ancient Greek religion did include chthonic rites, offerings to the dead, consultations at oracles of the underworld, and later sources describe necromantic sites where the boundary between living and dead was treated as negotiable. The Odyssey's version is stylized, yes, but stylization is what you do when you're allowed to show the gesture, but not the full ceremony. Why would a poem keep such details? Perhaps because they were too widely known to erase. Or perhaps because they were dangerous in a different way, not politically, but psychologically. A culture living after rupture might be haunted, and haunting seeks technique. When the archive is gone, people look for counsel elsewhere. They consult elders, then ancestors, then the dead themselves. They stare into caves and springs and smoke. They ask questions that cannot be answered by the living, because the living no longer remember. Odysseus's descent becomes a method for surviving discontinuity. If the surface world cannot tell you where you belong, then go below the surface and demand an answer from what was buried. But even the underworld episode contains a peculiar unease about control. The dead do not speak freely. They need blood. They need a transaction. Their knowledge feels costly, not only in the moment, but in what it does to the listener. After Odysseus hears them, he is not comforted. He is burdened. The future is not a clear road. It is a narrowing corridor. And this fits the saga's darker theme. Knowledge is not always liberation. Sometimes it is the kind of truth that makes sleep difficult, that makes home feel thinner, as if walls are only suggestions. If one follows this thread, then the monsters themselves start to look like displaced gods, or displaced human fears given teeth, so they can be narrated. Scylla and Charybdis are not merely nautical hazards. They are a choice between losses, the logic of catastrophe. Pick your damage. That is the logic of societies under stress too. When systems collapse, there is rarely a perfect escape. There is only the route that kills fewer. Turning that into a monster tale makes it bearable to repeat. It gives shape to the unspeakable. It teaches the listener how to endure impossible trade-offs without naming the real political or ecological conditions that produced them. And the sirens, those voices that promise total knowing, begin to sound less like fantasy the longer one sits with them. They promise not pleasure, but comprehension, the intoxicating idea that everything can be made coherent. In a world with missing archives, what could be more seductive than a song that claims it will tell you all that happened, all the hidden causes, all the erased names? But the poem insists that to listen directly is death. To survive, Odysseus must bind himself, must restrict himself, must hear the knowledge without being allowed to move toward it. This is an unsettling image if one thinks about curated history. It implies that certain truths exist, that they can be heard, but only under constraint, only while bound, only while others, untempted, keep rowing. So perhaps Part 6 is not about monsters or magic at all. Perhaps it is about the management of older sacred forces and about the way a rebooted civilization learns to package the dangerous parts of its inheritance. Caves become nymph caves. Priestesses become witches. Local spirits become temptations. underworld techniques become heroic episodes rather than community rites. And through all of it, Odysseus moves like an instrument, testing how much of the old world can be touched without being allowed to return with him intact. Yet the poem cannot fully hide its longing for what it is hiding. It keeps returning to thresholds, to places where the air is cool and damp and ancient, where the mind imagines that something older than law still breathes, and that raises a question that feels heavier the more gently it is asked. If the Odyssey preserved fragments of older cults and older practices by disguising them, then what else might be disguised in plain sight, wearing the mask of a monster so that it could survive the new order's cleansing? And if a listener, bound like Odysseus, hears the siren song of the missing archive, how long can they stay safely tied to the mast before the ropes begin to feel like part of their skin? If there is a hidden archive in the Odyssey, then it does not lie only in caves or underworld pits. It lies in the ordinary rooms where power pretends to be normal. The last movement ended with the image of Odysseus bound to the mast, allowed to hear the promise of total knowing only under restraint, while others rode without listening. That image keeps echoing, because it is not only about temptation, it is about management, about who is permitted to hear, who is trained not to, and who does the rowing while someone else collects the meaning. And once that thought settles, quiet and heavy, the poem's politics begin to show through like dark grain in wood. The Odyssey is often described as a tale of homecoming, but what happens at home is not gentle. It is an audit. It is an investigation staged as a story. People are tested, not by questions written down, but by traps of language and gesture, by the pressure of scarcity, by loyalty squeezed until it reveals its shape. A beggar appears at the gate and the entire household becomes a laboratory. Who offers a crust? Who kicks? Who laughs too loud? Who calculates? And this does not feel accidental. It feels like a culture teaching itself a method for sorting the living into categories: the faithful, the opportunistic, the disposable. It is tempting to keep this comfortably moral, to say it is simply about virtue and vice. But the poem's violence is too organized for that comfort. The suitors are not only rude men, they're a social phenomenon, a crowd that has formed in the vacuum of a missing king, consuming resources, forcing a decision, turning delay into entitlement. They have names, lineages, networks. They are the sons of prominent families, not random thieves. Their presence implies a political reality in which a household is also a microstate, and a widow is also a contested succession. The poem is quiet about formal institutions because it does not need to explain them to its listeners. It assumes an audience that understands what a power vacuum does to a place, how quickly hospitality can become occupation when there is no strong hand to define the boundary. And then Odysseus returns, and the boundary is redrawn in blood. One can feel the old Bronze Age anxiety breathing under this. When palatial systems fracture, when archives burn and the administrative voice disappears, legitimacy becomes a more intimate weapon. It is claimed in halls, in marriage beds, in recognition tokens, in stories told convincingly enough to become reality. Who is the rightful king? Who has the right to eat from this storeroom? Who belongs inside the threshold and who must remain outside, hungry and watching? The Odyssey's fixation on the household as a battlefield begins to look like a cultural scar, a memory of times when the collapse of big order meant the rise of smaller, more personal tyrannies, the kind that sit at your table and call themselves guests. And yet the poem does not simply celebrate restoration. It is too haunted for that. Odysseus is not a radiant liberator. He's a man who has learned concealment so deeply that it has become his skin. He lies even when no lie is required. He tests people he loves as if love itself is an unreliable witness. He hoards his identity until the last possible second, and when he reveals it, the revelation is not a sunrise. It is a blade. This is the unsettling paradox. The return that is supposed to heal the world requires a level of suspicion that can poison the very thing it seeks to restore. Why would a tradition preserve a hero like this, unless it was preserving a lesson? In the archaic Greek world where the poem likely took its written shape, memory was not neutral entertainment, it was political capital. To sing of ancestors was to confer status on their descendants. To describe the heroic age was to offer models of authority, models of obedience, models of who deserves to rule and who deserves to serve. A bard's song could be a mirror for a community, but mirrors can be angled. A patron could reward certain versions, certain emphases, certain endings. The audience itself could enforce a kind of censorship through expectation. Tell us the story the way we like it, the way we need it, the way that keeps our world coherent. And coherence, after rupture, is addictive. So it becomes worth asking, softly, without accusation, what kind of social order the Odyssey is teaching while it pretends to only narrate. It teaches that a rightful man may return and take back what is his, even if years have passed and others have built their lives in the absence. It teaches that intruders may be slaughtered in a closed room, and the act can be framed as cleansing rather than massacre. It teaches that servants and women must be tested for loyalty, and that disloyalty or perceived disloyalty can be punished publicly. It teaches that a king's household is a moral universe, and that order is whatever the returning king says it is. And then the poem does something colder. It asks the listener to feel relief. Relief is a strange emotion to cultivate around piles of bodies. Yet the narrative pressure is designed to produce it. The suitors are shown violating rules of hospitality, wasting resources, plotting violence, humiliating the weak. By the time the bow is strung, the listener is primed to accept the blood as necessary. This is not crude propaganda. It is more sophisticated than that. It is a psychological technology. Make the violence feel like the restoration of cosmic balance. Make it feel like the house has been purified, as if death is a kind of sweeping. If history has been curated, this is exactly the sort of mechanism one would expect to survive. Because societies that reboot need stories that justify the reassertion of hierarchy. They need myths that make dominance feel like healing. They need narratives where suspicion is wisdom, where secrecy is prudence, where decisive cruelty is framed as justice. And once a culture has such a story in its bones, it can replay it in new contexts without noticing the repetition. The story becomes a tool that can be lifted and used whenever someone claims, "The house is mine, the guests are parasites, the cleansing is overdue." Still, the poem's unease leaks through the seams. There are moments when Odysseus seems less like a healer and more like a symptom. The disguise clings too well. The tests become rituals of paranoia. The homecoming resembles a coup carried out under the banner of legitimacy. And even after the slaughter, the text cannot simply rest. It has to address the aftermath, the inevitable ripple of revenge, the social consequences that do not vanish because the narrative would like to sleep. It is as if the tradition itself knows that violence does not close a story, it opens another. Even when gods intervene to force an ending, that intervention can feel less like comfort and more like a warning that the human cycle does not stop on its own. There is another shadow here, one that touches the poem's very existence. Oral tradition thrives on variation, on local colour, on the subtle power of changing a detail to fit the needs of a night's audience. But the Odyssey that survives is unusually coherent, unusually finished. That finish may be art, yes, but it may also be selection, a freezing, a moment when one version became official enough to eclipse others. If so, what did the other versions contain? A kinder Odysseus, a crueler one, a Penelope who did not remain untouched, a household that did not welcome the returning king, a community that had moved on, and a hero who returned too late. If any such variants existed, they would be dangerous, because they would loosen the poem's tight moral geometry. They would make return ambiguous. They would make legitimacy negotiable. They would make cleansing look like murder again. So the story that survives may be the safest story. Not safe in the sense of harmless, but safe in the sense of useful. Useful for teaching, useful for binding communities to a shared past, useful for making authority feel ancestral rather than improvised, and that usefulness is precisely what should keep a listener awake inside their sleepiness. Because usefulness is one of the quietest forms of control. Odysseus, the master of disguise, might be more than a character. He might be the poem confessing its own method. He returns wearing a false face. He speaks in crafted narratives. He hides his name until it can do the most damage. And when he finally says who he is, the room rearranges itself around that declaration, as if identity is not discovered but imposed. If the saga has been curated, perhaps it was curated in the same way. Not by blunt erasure, but by a story told so compellingly that it becomes the only story anyone can bear to remember. And if that is true, then the most unsettling question is not whether Odysseus existed, or where Ithaca truly lies, or which strait inspired which monster. The most unsettling question is whether the Odyssey is teaching listeners how to accept a certain kind of violence as homecoming, a certain kind of censorship as tradition, a certain kind of forgetting as peace. Because if a culture can be trained to feel relief at the right moment, trained to call cleansing justice, trained to treat suspicion as virtue, then how many times can that training be repeated before the house no longer belongs to anyone but the story itself? If the surviving Odyssey is the safest story, then safety has a sound. It is not the sound of truth arriving like a door thrown open. It is the softer sound of repetition, of phrases worn smooth by countless tongues, until the jagged edges of a more dangerous memory cannot catch the mind anymore. The last movement left violence sitting in the centre of the hall, not as an accident, but as a lesson polished into relief. Yet even that lesson depends on something more fragile than any sword. It depends on a voice that could carry a world across centuries when writing failed, or was delayed, or was withheld. And that dependence raises a contradiction that will not rest. If memory is so vulnerable to selection, why trust a song at all? And if a song can be trusted, what kind of machinery inside the human mind makes it possible? There is a strange intimacy in the way the Odyssey repeats itself, not in the sense of boredom, but in the sense of ritual. The same epithets return like familiar hands in the dark. Dawn arrives, rosy-fingered, so often that she begins to feel less like a moment in time and more like a key that turns in the lock of attention, letting the listener drift deeper into the tale. Ships are black, the sea is wine-dark, heroes are godlike, plans are cunning, hearts are enduring. These are not merely ornaments, they are tools, and tools imply a craft tradition older than any individual poet. The poem's language behaves like a memory device, as if it was designed not only to be beautiful, but to be survivable. Modern scholarship learned to name this survivability in the 20th century, when Milman Parry and later Albert Lord studied oral poets in the Balkans and saw something unsettlingly familiar. A singer could perform thousands of lines without memorizing them word for word, because the song was not a fixed text in the head. It was a method. It was a system of formulas and themes, flexible enough to fit different moments, strict enough to remain recognisably itself. The bard did not recite like a modern actor reading a script. He composed in performance, stitching lines together from inherited patterns, guided by rhythm the way a sailor is guided by stars. If this is even partly how Homeric epic lived before it was written down, then the Odyssey becomes less like a document and more like a living organism that reproduced through mouths. But living organisms mutate. They adapt. They shed what does not serve. And that returns the mind to its unease. The very technology that lets a poem endure also lets it be altered without leaving fingerprints. If a phrase is formulaic, it can be swapped for another phrase without breaking the meter. The way a lock accepts a different key cut to the same pattern. If a scene is thematic, it can be expanded, compressed, shifted, retold with a different moral emphasis, while still feeling true to the tradition. So the question sharpens, quiet as a blade under cloth. Did oral tradition preserve the past, or did it make the past easy to edit? The Odyssey sometimes feels like it is aware of this danger, because it is obsessed with speech acts that change reality. Odysseus survives by telling stories that are technically false but socially effective. He lies and the world rearranges itself around the lie, because people respond to the shape of a narrative more than to the raw fact of a body. He speaks, and doors open. He speaks, and suspicion softens. He speaks, and a stranger becomes a guest. The poem's hero is a master of verbal engineering, and that mastery mirrors the poem's own situation. If the Odyssey was carried for generations by singers who adjusted it to their audience, then the hero's talent may not be an incidental trait. It may be a confession of the medium. Language is not only a carrier of memory, it is an instrument of control. There's another subtlety that matters here, almost physiological. Sound enters the body differently than writing does. It does not wait politely on a page. It arrives as vibration, slipping through defences, pressing into the chest, making the listener's own breath unconsciously synchronize with the cadence. In a world where literacy was limited, public performance was not entertainment at the margins. It was a social event where the group's emotional rhythm could be tuned. A community could be taught what to admire, what to fear, what to call order, and what to call pollution, all without ever stating it like law. If a story is repeated at feasts, at festivals, in halls where patrons reward singers, then the story becomes a kind of training, even when everyone believes they are only listening, and training, after rupture, can look like comfort. A people who live through collapse, through shifting coastlines of power, through hunger and raids and the shame of not knowing which name to swear by, would crave a narrative that holds. The repeated phrases would feel like stones underfoot in a landscape that keeps moving. The familiar scenes would reassure them that life still has structure. The guest is welcomed, the meal is shared, the test is endured, the rightful identity is eventually recognized. Even when the story is violent, the violence is framed, placed inside a rhythm that implies meaning. The listener can sleep inside the certainty of cadence, even as the content whispers that the world is predatory. Yet the Homeric tradition also leaves traces of its own seams, places where one can almost hear competing versions rubbing together. A name appears with an odd echo, a genealogy feels stitched, a detail of custom seems older than the surrounding scene, like a shard of Mycenaean pottery embedded in a later wall. Scholars have long noted that the poems preserve words and expressions that appear archaic, relics of earlier Greek dialects or earlier social realities, surviving inside a later linguistic frame. This is one reason. The Homeric question never dies. The text feels composite, like driftwood gathered from different storms. But composite does not mean false. It means layered. and layers, if one is patient, can reveal not only age but intention. If some phrases are fossils, who decided they should remain visible? And if other fossils were removed, what kind of past was deemed too sharp to keep? The arrival of the Greek alphabet in the early 1st millennium BCE adds another quiet disturbance. Once a tradition is written down, it changes its nature. A performance becomes an object. Variants become mistakes. The living flexibility of oral composition begins to harden into the authority of a fixed sequence. Writing is often imagined as salvation, rescuing art from forgetfulness. But rescue can be another kind of capture. When a poem is fixed, it stops evolving openly and starts evolving behind the scenes, through editing, through selection, through which copy survives and which perishes, through which city claims the best version, and which local tradition becomes provincial noise. A written Odyssey can travel farther, yes, but it can also become centralized, made official, made safe. So the listener is left with a paradox that feels almost tender in its cruelty. Oral tradition can preserve astonishing amounts of detail, not as a photograph but as a patterned memory. Yet that same patterning can make manipulation smooth, because the song can absorb ideological adjustments without losing its hypnotic feel. A bard can emphasize the restoration of hierarchy to please a patron. A scribe can prefer one variant to stabilize a civic identity. A later reader can treat the stabilized version as eternal and forget that it was once fluid. And all of this can happen without a single villain, without a council of conspirators, simply because systems of memory respond to incentives the way plants respond to light. There is a deeper, darker intimacy in this, because it suggests that erasure does not always require fire. It can happen through beauty, a line that scans perfectly, an image that pleases the ear, can outcompete a harsher line that tells a less flattering truth. A version that comforts the living can survive longer than a version that accuses them. In that sense, the Odyssey's music becomes suspect, not because it is ugly, but because it is too capable. The very seduction that makes it last may also be the method by which it edits the past into something bearable, and still, the poem keeps a nervous awareness of what it costs to hear too much. The sirens offered total knowledge, and it would have killed. Odysseus listened only while bound. That image returns now, but in a new disguise. Perhaps the culture itself was bound to the mast of its own tradition, allowed to hear hints of older truths, older rites, older political fractures, but only through formulas that kept the knowledge from becoming actionable. Bound by meter, bound by convention, bound by the need for the story to be singable at the feast, to be pleasing enough that it would be invited back. If that is the case, then the Odyssey is not merely an epic. It is an acoustic artifact of survival, a song shaped by catastrophe and by the human need to make catastrophe narratable. It is a sea route of sound carrying cargo that has been repacked so many times that no one can swear what was originally shipped. The listener drifts with it, soothed by repetition, unsettled by what repetition implies. A story that endures for millennia is rarely innocent. It has been chosen again and again, and every choice leaves something behind in the dark. So the fog thickens around the voice itself, around the unseen singer and the unseen audience, around the moment a living performance became a fixed text. If the poem could be edited by beauty, then what truths were too ugly to survive the melody? If memory can be trained through cadence, then who has been rowing all this time, keeping the rhythm steady, while the bound listener hears only what is permitted? And if the safest story is the one that lasts, what happens to a culture when it has forgotten how to recognize the difference between what is true and what is simply unforgettable? If the safest story is the one that lasts, then perhaps the most dangerous story is the one that must be taken inward, where no scribe can standardize it and no audience can reward it for being pleasing. The last movement lingered on sound as a technology, on cadence as a gentle form of control, on beauty as a kind of erasure that does not need flames. But there is a place in the Odyssey where the music seems to grow colder, where the poem admits, almost despite itself, that certain knowledge cannot be carried in daylight at all. It must be approached the way one approaches a ruin at night, with slow steps and an unwilling reverence. Because what happens when the archive is missing is not only that a culture forgets, it is that a person becomes an orphan of explanation, and an orphan eventually learns a darker skill: how to descend. The underworld is often treated as spectacle, a dramatic pivot in an old epic. Yet it can also be heard as method, like a tool passed through generations who lived among gaps. When the surface world offers no paperwork of meaning, when the past has been rebooted and repainted, where else can someone go to ask what happened and what must happen next? The living are not reliable witnesses. They are hungry, frightened, bribed by comfort, distracted by rebuilding. The dead, at least, are finished with ambition. And still the poem makes even the dead conditional. They do not speak freely. They must be drawn. They must be paid. Odysseus digs, pours, sprinkles, offers blood, and then waits. He does not stroll into knowledge. He bargains for it, as if truth itself has been pushed into a corner where it only comes out when it smells of something warm. In that detail is a quiet cruelty. The dead require blood to speak, and blood is the most intimate currency. It implies that answers are never free, and that the cost is not only moral but visceral. A culture that has lost its written memory might become obsessed with this exchange. If the archives burned, perhaps the only remaining library is the body, the wound, the scar, the sacrifice. It is not comforting, but it is coherent. After all, the Odyssey is already a story obsessed with scars, recognition marks, private proofs hidden beneath public masks. The underworld makes the obsession explicit. To know, one must open something. Yet even then, the knowledge delivered is not clean. The dead do not provide a satisfying explanation of the world's rupture. They provide fragments, warnings, griefs with teeth still in them, and the poem seems to understand that this is what real consultation feels like. Oracles do not restore certainty. They rearrange anxiety into a more specific shape. They do not heal the wound, they teach the wound to speak. And perhaps that is why the underworld episode has endured so stubbornly across cultures, returning again and again in later literature, later philosophy, later psychology, as if humans keep rediscovering the same desperate move. When the surface becomes untrustworthy, go below. When the public story feels curated, find the private one. When history erases, search the place where erasure becomes a presence. There is a way to hear Odysseus in this descent that is colder than heroism. He is not brave in the simple sense. He is compelled. He is a man who has learned that survival requires instruction, and instruction requires sources that have not been trained to lie politely. The living world has too many incentives. The dead have fewer, but they are not kind. They are thin. They are bitter. They are not a council of wise ancestors seated in calm dignity. They are hungry shades, and hunger is not only a physical condition. It is a metaphysical complaint. It is the feeling of having been cut off from what made you solid. If the Odyssey is a curated memory, this scene is where the curation trembles. Because nothing here feels celebratory. Nothing here flatters the listener. The air is wrong. The guidance is grim. And the dead are not impressed by cleverness. They are not seduced by good speech. They do not care how well a line scans. It is as if the poem, which elsewhere can be trained into comfort by repetition, here cannot fully domesticate the dread of what it is depicting. The underworld refuses to become a pleasant metaphor. It insists on being an accusation of the world above. You live on a thin crust. You build your houses on top of silence. You call it tradition because you cannot bear to call it forgetting. And then, quietly, the descent begins to resemble a psychological act. Not modern psychology with its tidy terms, but the older truth that people have always known in their bones. If the outer archive is missing, the inner archive becomes louder. Dreams thicken, guilt multiplies. The faces of the lost return in the mind's dark corridors. Survivors do not only mourn, they're haunted by logistics. What if one choice had been different? What if one turn had been avoided? What if one name had been spoken at the right moment? Trauma is an unpaid debt that keeps sending letters. The underworld is where those letters are opened, and perhaps that is why the Odyssey treats homecoming as so unstable. Odysseus does not return as a man who has completed a journey. He returns as a man carrying an underworld in his chest, a private population of the dead. His companions are gone. His youth is gone. Whole stretches of time have been eaten by islands that offered forgetting as comfort. Even his identity has been worn and reworn like a cloak borrowed from strangers. When he comes back to Ithaca disguised, one can hear it not only as strategy, but as symptom. A man who has lived too long in uncertainty does not step easily into certainty. He brings his suspicion home the way sailors bring salt into a house without noticing. The floor becomes gritty. The air tastes faintly metallic. Everyone who touches him feels it. So the underworld is not only an episode, it is the poem quietly explaining the cost of a world with gaps. It is saying that when the historical record breaks, when institutions fail, when writing vanishes and returns later with different masters, people will try to repair the rupture by any means available. They will consult stones, stars, strangers, gods. And when that fails, they will consult the dead. And when that fails too, they will consult the most dangerous witness of all, themselves. But the self is not a stable archive. It edits even more ruthlessly than a bard. It turns pain into symbols. It turns shame into monsters. It turns the ordinary brutality of hunger into a divine storm, because it is easier to forgive a god than to forgive a neighbour. It turns political upheaval into a family drama, because family drama is the scale the mind can hold without breaking. If the Odyssey is indeed a stitched narrative over a tear, then the underworld reveals the underside of the stitching. It shows the frayed threads. It shows how much of the past is held together by the refusal to look too closely at what was cut away. And there is another unsettling possibility, one that fits the saga's long suspicion of curated memory. What if the underworld scene is itself a kind of permission slip? Not permission to know everything, but permission to believe that knowledge belongs to a certain kind of person. The hero can descend and return. The ordinary listener cannot. The hero can hear warnings and still keep moving. The ordinary listener must accept the story as proxy, must receive the underworld second hand, filtered through the voice that knows how to make dread singable. In that sense, even descent can be managed. Even darkness can be distributed as controlled dosage, so it does not overthrow the social order that needs the story to remain useful. And yet, despite all management, the scene leaves a residue that cannot be fully controlled. It leaves the suspicion that the most important archive is gone not because it was lost accidentally, but because it was too heavy to carry into the rebuilt world. The dead can speak, but only briefly, only with payment, only with conditions. The past can be consulted, but it will not restore what was. It will only tell you, with a kind of weary precision, what costs are still coming. So the ninth movement ends with a question that is not meant to be answered quickly, especially not at this hour when the mind is already half in shadow. If the Odyssey survived because it was beautiful enough to be repeated, and if beauty can be a kind of erasure, then what does it mean that its darkest knowledge appears only in a descent, only in a place where voices need blood to form words? What is the poem hinting that the surface world cannot hold? And if a culture learns to consult its dead in order to navigate its missing history, how long before it begins to prefer the dead, because the living keep rewriting the story? If a culture begins to prefer the dead, it is not because death is wiser, it is because death is quieter. The dead do not lobby for their version of events. They do not demand footnotes. They do not correct the living when the living arrange the past into something usable. They simply remained like cold stones underwater, letting the current smooth them into whatever shape the hand expects to feel. And after the descent, after that brief and costly conversation in the dark, a colder suspicion begins to form, one that does not accuse so much as it watches. What if the missing archive was not only lost but relieved of its weight? What if the rupture didn't merely happen to the world, but was guided, exploited, curated, until forgetting became a kind of policy, even when no one called it that? It is easy to imagine curation as a conspiracy, a room full of people making decisions. The Odyssey itself would caution against such comfort. It knows that power does not always need a meeting. Power can be a habit. It can be an instinct that emerges wherever resources are scarce and legitimacy is fragile. In the centuries after palaces fell, someone had to rebuild authority from scattered parts, from kinship, from land claims, from marriage alliances, from the ritual language of oaths, from stories that could be performed in public to make private ownership feel like a communal truth. Story becomes scaffolding, and scaffolding is rarely neutral. It holds some shapes up while it leaves other shapes to collapse quietly in the dark. One can almost feel how the Odyssey might have helped, not by reporting the past, but by disciplining the future. It teaches that identity is a hidden thing, revealed only when the time is right. It teaches that the rightful man can be absent and still remain rightful. It teaches that delay does not cancel possession, that a house can be occupied and still belong to the one who returns with the correct name and the correct violence. It teaches that some bloodshed can be reframed as cleansing, and that a room can be made pure again if the right bodies fall in the right order. And if that training is repeated long enough, it begins to feel like nature, like the sea itself, inevitable, ancient, unarguable. But then there is the poem's nervousness, the way it cannot stop leaking the feeling that something is wrong. Odysseus is the hero of return, yet his return does not bring softness. It brings suspicion into the bed, a blade into the hall, tests into the mouths of people who are already exhausted. Even the loyal are required to prove their loyalty, as if loyalty is never allowed to be a resting place. This is not simply drama. It is a kind of social weather. It suggests that the world the poem grew out of had learned to live with the expectation of betrayal, the expectation that what you built could be eaten while you were gone, the expectation that the past could be stolen and then defended by those who stole it. In such a climate, a story that normalizes the harshness of reclaiming becomes not entertainment, but insulation. And yet, insulation can become a prison. When a narrative keeps a society warm, it also keeps it contained. If the archive is missing, and the story is all that remains, then the story becomes the horizon. And a horizon, by definition, is the line you cannot walk past. It always moves away as you approach. That might be the deepest seduction of epics. They offer the feeling of vastness while quietly ensuring that the listener never leaves the sanctioned world. Monsters are placed at the edges so the mind does not wander too far. Gods are placed above so responsibility can be negotiated, and whenever the past threatens to become too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too likely to implicate the listener's own ancestors, the poem offers a ritual answer. This is fate. This is divine will. This is the way things must be for order to return. But what if the rupture was not only a season of drought and fire? What if it was also a season of opportunity, when new powers could rise precisely because the record was broken? It is not necessary to imagine a single hand rewriting everything. It is enough to imagine many small hands, each adjusting memory to fit immediate need. A village tells the tale slightly differently because its chief wants a noble ancestor. A city prefers a version where kingship looks sacred because it is trying to stabilize itself. A travelling singer learns which lines earn meat and which lines earn silence. A scribe, later, chooses the version that seems most coherent, or most prestigious, or most politically convenient, and the discarded variants do not need to be burned. They simply stop being repeated. They die without drama, the way a language dies when children no longer speak it. This is curation by gravity, not by decree. It happens the way silt settles in a harbour, slowly, inevitably, until the water that once held ships becomes too shallow for anything but small boats. A tradition can remain alive and still become less navigable. The safe passages remained. The dangerous depths are filled in. And then, generations later, someone stands at the edge and says the sea has always been like this. They do not know what was dredged away. There are hints, though, that the Odyssey remembers what it is doing, at least in flashes. It is a poem obsessed with forgetting and forced remembrance. The lotus offers oblivion as sweetness. Circe offers transformation that makes men stop being men. Calypso offers a perfect pause, time without consequence, the soft annihilation of purpose. The sirens offer total knowledge that kills. Again and again, Odysseus is tempted by states that resemble what a post-collapse society might crave. Forget the loss, become something else, stop struggling, accept a beautiful story and lie down inside it. And again, he refuses, not because he is clean, but because he is hungry for the particular. He wants one bed, one name, one household arranged in one way. His longing is not only romantic, it is archival. He wants a version of the world that can be verified by touch. And that is where the warning begins to sharpen. Because the desire for a single verifiable home can also be weaponized. If a community becomes convinced that its identity depends on one pure lineage, one pure narrative, one pure return, it will begin to treat anything else as contamination. It will begin to call outsiders monsters. It will begin to call internal dissent treachery. It will begin to dream of cleansing, the way the Odyssey dreams of it, until cleansing becomes not an act but a reflex. This is how a story that once soothed survival can later justify cruelty, not because it teaches cruelty outright, but because it makes cruelty feel like the price of continuity. And still, the poem refuses to rest in that comfort either. It shows that even after the bodies fall, even after the household is reclaimed, the social world does not magically forgive. The cycle of retaliation waits just outside the door. Peace must be forced, and a peace that must be forced does not feel like peace. It feels like a lid pressed down on boiling water, which raises the final, quiet terror. Perhaps the Odyssey is not promising that return is possible. Perhaps it is confessing that return is always incomplete, always purchased, always shadowed by what was done to make it happen. Perhaps the true home is not restored, only rearranged into a shape that can be endured. So the saga ends where it began, inside a gap. But now the gap is not only historical, it is intimate. It is the space between what happened and what can be admitted, between what was lost and what can be carried, between the living, who keep rewriting, and the dead, who keep waiting. Somewhere in that space, a story is still being curated, not once but continually every time it is repeated, every time it is taught as the past, every time its beauty is used to make its violence feel inevitable. And if that is true, then perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that Odysseus was fictional, or that Ithaca moved, or that Troy was layered and argued over. The most unsettling possibility is that the mechanism that preserved the Odyssey is the same mechanism that can preserve any safe version of the past. A version polished until it becomes unforgettable. A version that offers relief at exactly the moment the listener should feel uneasy. Because if a civilization can survive a rupture by turning trauma into a song, what stops it from surviving the next rupture by turning the truth into something even smoother, even kinder, even harder to question, until the very act of questioning feels like a betrayal of home,